3 years before Jack the Ripper ever picked up a knife in the fog of London, someone in Austin, Texas was already doing the same thing. Worse, actually. He killed more people, he worked for longer, and he terrorized an entire American capital city for a full year. And he was never caught. So why has almost nobody ever heard of him? Just before we continue, please tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Also, I'm happy to let you know that we are now on Spotify. Click the link in the description or on the channel profile to enjoy our stories on Spotify. And if you fancy a free book of dark history, I have something for you in the comments. On the night of December 30th, 1884, a man named Walter Spencer woke up in the dark. He was lying in a small servant's cabin behind a house on West Pecan Street in Austin, and his head was warm with blood. Something had struck him while he slept, hard enough to open his scalp and leave him dazed. When he reached across the narrow bed for the woman who shared it with him, a cook named Molly Smith, his hand found nothing but empty sheets. He staggered up, half conscious, and pushed out into the freezing yard, calling her name into the December cold. And behind the house, near the outhouse, lying in the snow, he found her. Molly Smith was 30 years old. She had been dragged out of her own bed while she slept, carried across the yard, and killed with an axe. The wounds were so severe that the men who arrived at first light could barely stand to look at what was left. There was blood tracked through the cabin. There was a bloody handprint smeared on a door. And there was the weapon itself, an axe taken from the family's own woodpile, left behind at the scene like an afterthought. Nobody understood it yet, standing in that gray morning light with their breath fogging the air. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 12 months, the same nightmare would repeat itself, again and again and again, across the city of Austin. And the reason it kept happening, the reason this one killer was handed an entire year to do his work, is a story that says as much about America as it does about the man holding the axe. So why did nobody stop him? To answer that, we have to go back to the city where it happened and understand what kind of place Austin really was in 1885. Forget the Austin, you know. Forget the skyline, the music, the tech money. In 1885, Austin was a raw frontier capital of roughly 22,000 people, planted on the banks of the Colorado River, muddy when it rained and choked with dust when it didn't. Cattle still moved through parts of town. Congress Avenue ran wide and unpaved from the river up toward Capitol Hill, where crews of workmen were slowly raising an enormous new state house out of pink Texas granite, block by heavy block. It would become one of the largest Capitol buildings in the country. To the people living there, that rising granite dome was proof of everything they believed about their city. Austin was young. Austin was booming. Austin was going somewhere. New railroads had connected the town to the wider country. New money was arriving every week. There were fine hotels, an opera house, gas lamps flickering along the main streets, and a growing class of prosperous families building large frame houses with wide porches and manicured yards. From the outside, it looked like a small American success story in motion. But like every southern city in that era, Austin was really two cities stacked on top of each other, sharing the same streets and pretending not to. There was the Austin of the comfortable and the well-off, the families in the big houses with their parlors and their pianos. And then there was the Austin that kept all of that running. The cooks, the laundresses, the housemaids, the manservants, the yardmen. Most of them were black, and many of them had been born into slavery only 20 years before, freed by a war that had ended within living memory, and now working long days for low pay. They didn't live in the big houses, they lived behind them, in small wooden cabins and lean-to quarters set back in the yards, close enough to be called at any hour, separated by a few steps of packed dirt and an entire social order. That detail is the key to this whole case, because the killer understood it perfectly, maybe better than anyone else in the city. He did not break down the front doors of the mansions. He went to the cabins out back. He chose his victims from the exact group of people that Austin society had already trained itself not to look at too closely. Servants, working women, black women, at first, sleeping alone or with their families in exposed little rooms with flimsy doors and windows that didn't lock. He targeted the people the city had decided, in advance, not to worry about. And for months, that decision was the best protection a murderer could ask for. Molly Smith's death did make the papers. It was violent and strange, and for a few days, it was the talk of the town. The police did what police in 1885 did in a case like this. They looked for a black man to arrest. They took in a laborer connected to the household, held him, leaned on him, and eventually let him go, because there was nothing tying him to the murder except proximity and the color of his skin. And then, with no real suspect and no answers, Austin exhaled and moved on. The brutal killing of a servant woman on the last night of the year was a tragedy, but it was not, in the eyes of the city's newspapers and its leaders, a crisis. Not yet. Winter passed, spring came, and with the warm weather, the killer came back. By May of 1885, the second murder had arrived. Her name was Eliza Shelley. She was around 30 years old, a cook, and she lived in a cabin behind her employer's house with her 3 young sons. She was a mother, working to keep her children fed, sleeping in the same small room with her boys, because that was the only room she had. One of her own children was the one who found her. Eliza had been attacked in the dead of night, in the very room where she lay beside her sons. She had been struck in the head with terrible, deliberate force. The killer had come in silently, while the whole family slept, done what he came to do, only feet from her sleeping children, and slipped back out into the dark. One of her little boys later said that he had woken in the night and seen a man in the room, a barefoot figure moving in the blackness near his mother. But he was a small child, terrified out of his mind, and it was the middle of the night. He could not say who the man was, or where he had gone. This is where the story quietly becomes something the city could no longer pretend not to understand. Because this was not one random horror anymore. This was the second woman in 5 months, both black, both domestic servants, both attacked in their own beds in the middle of the night, both struck savagely about the head. The method was too specific to be coincidence. The victims were too alike. Any city paying attention would have felt the cold, sick recognition settling into its stomach. A single killer, a pattern, a hunter. But Austin was not paying attention, not to these women. The arrests that followed Eliza Shelley's death were, once again, a matter of rounding up black men who happened to be nearby, including at one point someone barely more than a boy. They were held, questioned, pressured, and eventually released, because not one of them had done it. The investigation spun in circles, chasing the wrong people for the oldest and ugliest of reasons, while the real killer stayed exactly where he wanted to be, unseen, unsuspected, free to plan the next one. And before that summer had even fully arrived, there was a third. Her name was Irene Cross. She was around 32 years old, and she worked as a servant on the east side of Austin. The attack on Irene was different in one detail that made it even more horrifying. She did not die at once. The killer had used a blade on her rather than a single crushing blow, slashing at her head and her arm so severely that some who saw the wounds compared them to a scalping. She had defensive injuries, the marks of a woman trying to fight, trying to lift her arms against the thing coming down on her in the dark. And she survived the initial attack long enough to speak. She was able to say, before she died, that a man had come into her room and done this to her. 3 black women, now, in the space of half a year, killed in the same neighborhoods, in the same way, in the same defenseless position, asleep in their own homes at night. And still, the response from the city's institutions was muted. There was reporting in the Austin Daily Statesman, but the tone sat closer to grim local news than to genuine alarm. There was no serious, sustained manhunt. There was no protection offered to the community that was so obviously being targeted. No extra patrols sent to guard the servant quarters. No warning campaign. Nothing that treated these women as citizens whose lives the city was responsible for keeping safe. Now imagine the same 3 killings, but the victims are white women from the big houses on the avenue. Austin would have shut down. The governor would have been on it within a day. The story would have run in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The entire machinery of the state would have turned to face the threat. Instead, because the dead were black servants, the machinery barely turned at all. You would think someone with authority would have stood up, connected the obvious dots, and sounded the alarm. Someone with the power to actually do something. Nobody did. Think about that for a second. A predator was moving methodically through a southern capital, killing sleeping women one after another, and the people best positioned to stop him had decided, before he even started, that his victims simply were not worth the trouble. That indifference was not just a moral failure sitting quietly in the background. It was an active ingredient in the murders. Every month the city looked away was another month the killer used to learn the streets, refine his method, and grow bolder. The silence of Austin was, in a very real sense, working for him. And by the late summer of 1885, he was about to do something that even a city built on looking away would find impossible to ignore. Because the next victim was a child. In the late summer of 1885, the killer came to a cabin where a woman named Rebecca Ramey lived and worked. Rebecca had a daughter named Mary. Mary was 11 years old. That night, the intruder attacked Rebecca first. He struck her hard enough to knock her unconscious and leave her helpless on the floor. And then, while her mother lay senseless in the dark, he took the child. Mary Ramey, 11 years old, was carried out of the home and taken a short distance away, to an outbuilding on the property. And there she was murdered. When Rebecca finally came to and pieced together what had happened, when she understood that she had been lying knocked out cold while her daughter was carried off and killed only steps away, the weight of that is almost beyond describing. A mother, alive, unconscious, feet from her child, unable to do a single thing to stop it. Something in Austin shifted after Mary Ramey. A child, a little girl, torn out of a home and killed. Even a city determined to look the other way found that harder to swallow. The statesman's coverage grew sharper, more anxious. People began, quietly, to feel afraid. Not the entire city, not yet. But the ground had moved, and everyone could feel the tremor. And then came the worst night the city had seen so far. It was late September of 1885. In a cabin behind a house on San Jacinto Street, an 18-year-old woman named Gracie Vance was asleep. She was young, she was engaged to be married, and she shared the cabin that night with her fiancé, a man named Orange Washington, along with 2 other people. The killer came for all of them. He entered that small room and attacked the sleeping people inside it, one after another. Orange Washington was beaten so badly he would not survive his injuries. The 2 others in the cabin were struck and gravely wounded, left for dead, and Gracie herself was dragged out through a window, hauled across the yard, and killed near the stable, her body left behind the property in the dark. This was no longer a man slipping in to quietly kill one sleeping victim and vanish. This was a slaughter inside a single small room, 4 people attacked in a matter of minutes, and the raw savagery of it finally forced the truth all the way out into the open where no one could deny it. There was a pattern, there was one killer, and he was still out there in the city, somewhere, waiting. After the Vance murders, the authorities finally brought out bloodhounds to track the killer from the scene. The dogs caught a scent, followed it out into the night streets of Austin, and then lost it, as they always did. Because the killer knew this city. He knew the yards and the fences and the alleys, the dark gaps between the servant quarters and the main houses. He moved through Austin like a shadow that belonged there, and then he dissolved back into it before anyone could lay a hand on him. And catching a man like that, in 1885, was very nearly impossible even for a city that wanted to understand what the police in Austin actually had to work with. There were no fingerprints. The idea of identifying a criminal by the ridges on his hands was still years away from being used anywhere in the world. There was no blood typing, no forensic science worth the name, no crime lab, no reliable way to match a weapon to a wound beyond the naked eye. There were no useful photographs of the scenes, no system for sharing a description between towns, no criminal records anyone could search. Detective work in that era came down to 3 things: catching a man in the act, wringing a confession out of somebody, or finding a witness willing and able to point a finger. The Annihilator handed them none of the 3. He struck in the dead of night, in total darkness, while his victims slept. There was no confession, because he was never caught. And the only witnesses were terrified children who had glimpsed a shape in the black, and dying women who could manage only a few words before the end. A killer who was patient, who worked at night, and who chose victims nobody was guarding, was, to the police of 1885, a genuine ghost. For most of that year they were unwilling to hunt him, and by the time they finally tried, they discovered they barely had the tools to catch anyone at all. By the fall of 1885, The men in charge of Austin were at last forced to admit out loud what the black community had known for the better part of a year. Someone was hunting them. Someone had now killed at least 6 people, all of them tied to the servant class, all attacked in their sleep, all butchered with an axe or a blade. The city that had shrugged off the death of Molly Smith the previous December now had a monster on its hands that it could no longer pretend away. Night watchmen began appearing on some streets. Families who could afford it started sitting up in shifts, armed, waiting for a sound in the yard. But it was too little, and it came far too late. 5, 6, however you counted the dead, the killer had already gotten away with all of it. And if this were where the horror stopped, in the autumn of 1885, this would still be one of the darkest untold stories in American history. But it was not where he stopped. The final chapter, the one that finally shattered Austin completely, was still coming. And it would fall on the one night of the year when families are supposed to be safest of all. Before we get to that night, if a forgotten piece of history like this is exactly the kind of thing you want more of, take a second and subscribe. This channel goes deep on the dark corners of the past that the big true crime shows keep skipping right over. It genuinely helps the channel, and there is a lot more like this coming. Now, back to Austin, in the final weeks of 1885. By December, the fear in the city had taken on a strange, lopsided shape. The black residents of Austin had by now spent an entire year living under a threat their own government had been painfully slow to even acknowledge. In the servant quarters, families slept in shifts. Men sat up through the long nights with shotguns laid across their knees. People who could manage it abandoned their exposed cabins and crowded in together with relatives, choosing safety in numbers over privacy. The community that the city's institutions had failed was left with no choice but to defend itself, night after night, with whatever it had. The wealthy white side of Austin, meanwhile, still watched all of this from a comfortable distance. Awful, of course. Frightening, yes. But it was happening, they reassured one another, to other people, in other parts of town, behind the servants' cabins, not in the big houses, not to families like theirs. That comforting illusion died on Christmas Eve. On the night of December 24th, 1885, 2 women were murdered in Austin. Not 1, 2. On the same night, only about an hour apart, in 2 entirely different parts of the city. And both of them, for the first time in the entire year of killings, were white women from respectable, established households. The first was Susan Hancock. She was around 45 years old, the wife of a well-known Austin businessman, asleep in her own comfortable home. The killer got inside, pulled her from her bed, dragged her out into the backyard, and attacked her with the same signature brutality that had defined every murder before. A sharp instrument driven again and again into her head. Her family found her outside in the cold, catastrophically wounded. She would not survive. And while the Hancock household was collapsing into horror, across town, it was already happening a second time. The other victim that night was Eula Phillips. She was only 17 years old. She was married, a young wife and a mother, and she was staying at her in-laws' home for the holiday. The killer came into that house too. He pulled Eula from the bed she shared, carried her out into the backyard, and killed her there in the dark, leaving her body in the winter cold. Her husband, Jimmy Phillips, was found in the bed, struck and wounded in the same attack. 2 women, 2 households, 1 night. The very same method that had been used all year long on the servant women in their cabins, now used on the wife and the daughter-in-law of Austin's white establishment, in their own respectable homes, on Christmas Eve. And now, only now, the city completely lost its mind. The panic that had been building in one community for 12 long months exploded across the entire capital in a single night. This was no longer someone else's tragedy, in someone else's part of town. If the killer could reach a woman like Susan Hancock and a girl like Eula Phillips in their own beds, on Christmas Eve, then no one anywhere in Austin was safe. Not the rich, not the poor, not the guarded, not the sleeping. The fear became total and universal, all at once. The response was immediate and enormous. The city rushed to hire dozens of night watchmen. Wealthy citizens armed themselves and began patrolling their own streets after dark. Men formed vigilance committees. Rewards were posted for information. Every stranger, every drifter, Every unfamiliar face drew suspicion. The governor of Texas was drawn into the matter, and newspapers all across the country, papers that had barely spared a paragraph for the 5 earlier victims, suddenly ran the Austin murders on their front pages, because now, the dead were exactly the kind of victims the nation had been trained to grieve for. Read that again, slowly, because it holds the whole tragedy of this case in a single fact. 5 black women and a child had been slaughtered over the course of a year, and the country stayed quiet. 2 white women died on one night, and the country caught fire. The horror on both sides of that line was identical. The axe was the same. The method was the same. The terror those women felt in their final moments was the same. The only thing that changed was whose deaths the wider world had decided in advance were worth its attention. That is not a small detail hovering at the edge of this story. That is the story. The killer had built his entire year-long campaign on Austin's willingness to ignore certain victims. And the moment he finally chose victims the city refused to ignore, the whole world snapped its head around to look. And that frenzy reshaped daily life in Austin almost overnight. In the first weeks after Christmas, the city became a place ruled by fear. Men who had never carried a weapon in their lives now went armed everywhere they walked. Lanterns burned on porches all night long. Any unfamiliar face on the street after dark risked being stopped, questioned, or dragged in, and the jails began filling with drifters, transients, and strangers arrested on nothing more than a suspicious look and bad timing. People fired guns at shadows in their own yards. Every creak of a fence, every dog barking in the night, sent whole families lurching upright in the dark, certain that this was the moment the killer had come for them. The panic reshaped the city's economy too, in a way that exposed everything Austin had spent the year refusing to see. Many of the city's black domestic servants, the very people who had been the killer's first and most numerous victims, understandably refused to go on sleeping alone in exposed cabins behind their employers' houses. Some quit those positions. Some left Austin altogether. Households that had taken cheap, around-the-clock labor completely for granted suddenly found that labor frightened, unwilling, and scattering, and the comfortable machinery of the city's daily life began to stutter and jam. For one brief telling stretch, the people Austin had spent a year declining to protect became impossible to ignore, because without them, almost nothing in the city actually ran. The authorities set traps. They staked out likely spots, hoping to catch the killer mid-approach. They put out decoys. They doubled the patrols, and then doubled them again. And still, night after anxious night, the traps stayed empty. It was in the middle of this frenzy that the killer got the name. History would hang on him. As the Austin press strained to describe a murderer who seemed to specialize in killing household servants, the phrase that stuck was chilling in its cold, casual accuracy: the servant girl annihilator. It is often pointed to as one of the earliest times an American newspaper handed a serial murderer a lurid nickname, the same grim instinct that would soon brand Jack the Ripper, and every headline killer who came after him. And there is one more strange thread woven into this exact moment in Austin's history. Living in the city at the time was a sharp, funny young man in his 20s, named William Sidney Porter. He worked as a clerk, he had a gift for words, and he was both fascinated and appalled by the killings unfolding all around him. In his personal letters, he wrote about the murders and about the darkly clever nickname the town had coined for the man behind them. Years later, that same young clerk would leave Texas, remake himself into one of the most beloved short story writers in American history, and publish under a different name entirely. You know him as O. Henry, the man who would one day give the world its gentlest, most sentimental Christmas stories, once lived through a real Austin Christmas, soaked in blood, and set it down on paper while it was happening. So the city was armed. The country was finally watching. The pressure was overwhelming and everywhere. And then, after the 2 murders on Christmas Eve of 1885, something happened that no one has ever been able to fully explain. The killings stopped. After a solid year of escalating slaughter, after at least 8 victims across a single American city, the servant girl annihilator simply vanished. There was no final murder that closed the chapter. No dramatic chase and capture. No confession scrawled out in a jail cell. Christmas Eve was the end of it, and the question of why has haunted this case for well over a century. For a while, the manhunt ground on anyway. The watchmen stayed out. Arrests still happened. Coroners' inquests were held over the bodies. Sober men gathered in a room, trying to reason their way toward a killer, with almost nothing solid in front of them. But the inquests led nowhere, because there was nowhere for them to lead. No weapon that could be traced to a hand. No witness who could name a face. No science that could turn a bloody yard into an identity. One by one, the leads went cold, and then the whole case went cold along with them. The watchmen were eventually stood down. The granite capital was finished and dedicated. The city kept right on growing, and the murders that had gripped Austin for a year began, season by season, to fade out of the conversation, until they had nearly vanished from the city's memory altogether. It would take more than a century for the full story to be assembled again. Long after everyone who had lived through it was gone, researchers and writers went back into the old Austin archives, into the yellowing newspaper columns and the coroner's records and the private letters people had left behind, and pieced that grim year back together out of the fragments. That is a large part of the reason you are hearing any of this at all. The servant girl annihilator did not live on in America's memory the way Jack the Ripper lived on in Britain's. He had to be dug back up out of the paper trail, decades after the last person who feared him had died quietly in bed. So who was he? Over the decades, several answers have been offered. Not one of them has ever truly held. The first suspects were the ones Austin reached for out of pure reflex. Black men from the community, arrested in waves after nearly every single murder, hauled in, held, questioned and pressured, and then released, one after another, because the evidence was never there. These arrests solved nothing, and were never going to solve anything. They were driven by the prejudice of the era, not by proof, and every last one of those men was ultimately cleared. The real killer was never among them. He was watching all of it happen, safe behind the assumption that the guilty man would always be found somewhere in the servant class. Then, after Christmas Eve, suspicion swung in a new and unsettling direction. Toward the husbands. In the aftermath of the two white women's deaths, some of the authorities began to wonder whether at least one of those final killings had actually been a domestic murder, dressed up to look like the work of the annihilator, so the real motive would hide inside the larger panic. Jimmy Phillips, Eula's young husband, who had himself been found wounded in the bed, was put on trial for her murder. He was convicted at first, and then that conviction was thrown out on appeal, and he did not remain a condemned man. Susan Hancock's husband, too, fell under the suspicion of some in the city. But the theory of the husbands could never really stand on its own 2 feet, because it could not explain the pattern. It could not account for the 5 servant women killed in the exact same way, in the exact same defenseless position, spread across the exact same city, over the months before Christmas Eve ever arrived. Some people convinced themselves that focusing on the husbands finally gave them the full picture. They were wrong. No jealous husband could explain the entire year of murders that came first. The husbands were a distraction that let the city imagine the horror had a small, private, containable explanation. It never did. Which brings us to the strangest theory of them all, the one that reaches across an ocean and ties Austin, Texas to the most infamous unsolved murders in the entire world. Some later writers, looking back on the case, noticed a piece of timing that is genuinely hard to shake. The Austin murders stopped cold at the very end of 1885. Less than 3 years later, in the autumn of 1888, an unknown killer began murdering and mutilating women in the Whitechapel district of London. The world would come to call that man Jack the Ripper. And Jack the Ripper, exactly like the annihilator before him, was never caught, never named, never brought to any kind of justice. 2 unidentified killers, in 2 different countries, both preying on vulnerable women, both slipping away into history without a face or a name. It was almost impossible not to ask the question, could they have been the same man? One version of this theory points to a specific figure, a cook, sometimes described as a Malay man named Maurice, who had reportedly been working in Austin during the period of the murders, and who was said to have left the city not long before the Whitechapel killings began an ocean away. It is exactly the kind of detail that sets the imagination on fire. An unknown killer goes quiet in Texas. An unknown killer begins his work in London, and somewhere in the space between them stands a shadowy traveler who was in the right place at the right time. But it is important to be honest about what this actually is. The London connection is speculation, not evidence. It surfaced long after the fact, built on suggestive timing and a compelling coincidence rather than any hard chain of proof, and most serious historians treat it as a fascinating theory and nothing more. There is no solid documented link running from the killer in Austin to the streets of Whitechapel. It is a haunting, maybe. That is all. But the fact that the case can even reach that far, that its unanswered questions stretch clear across the Atlantic, tells you just how deep and how strange this whole thing runs. What we are left with, in the end, is a story that history very nearly lost entirely. In 1927, a writer named Herbert Asbury looked back at the Austin murders and framed the killer as something the country had not yet had a proper name for when it was happening. In the language we use today, we would call the servant girl annihilator one of the first documented serial killers in American history. He predates Jack the Ripper by 3 years. He predates H.H. Holmes and the so-called murder castle of the Chicago World's Fair. He was here first, hunting in an American capital city, and yet his name has been almost completely scrubbed out of the story we tell ourselves about our own past. And the reason for that erasure is the very same reason he was never caught in the first place. Think back to the 2 women who stand at either end of this story. Molly Smith, 30 years old, a cook, killed in the snow on the last night of 1884, and Eula Phillips, 17 years old, killed in a backyard on Christmas Eve, 1 year later, almost to the day. Same city, same killer, same axe. 2 young women, murdered in their sleep, 12 months apart. But their deaths were not treated as equals. Molly's murder earned a few days of headlines and then a long, comfortable silence. Eula's murder set an entire nation ablaze. The gap between those 2 reactions was never about the crime itself, because the crime was identical in almost every way that mattered. The gap was about who the world had already decided was worth its grief. That is the real horror at the center of the servant girl annihilator. A monster walked through Austin for a year and got away clean, yes. But underneath that, something colder. He understood his own society better than his society understood itself. He knew, with terrible precision, whose deaths would be quietly filed away and whose deaths would bring the whole world running. He built an entire year of murder on top of that knowledge, and the indifference of a whole city became his most reliable accomplice. And by the time that indifference finally cracked open, on one single Christmas Eve, it was already far too late to catch the man who had been counting on it all along. We remember Jack the Ripper. We put him in films, in novels, in 100 documentaries and 1,000 articles. We forgot the servant girl annihilator almost completely, even though he came first, killed more, and left just as many questions echoing behind him. And maybe that forgetting is the last, quietest lesson the case has left us. Because history does not only record who died, it records who we decided was worth remembering. For a very long time, the answer to that question in Austin was almost nobody at all. If you want more stories like this one, the true cases that the big shows keep skipping over, subscribe and stick around. There are a lot more forgotten nights waiting to be told.